All right, hello everyone to the second part of this week's lecture, which is on the history of ethics in research and statistics. I warn you in advance, this is not a fun topic and it covers a lot of the darker part of Canada's history. And for that, I've got my lovely teaching assistant, Molly, assisting me again. And Molly ran away. All right, so a lot of the problems that emerged historically and why we currently see so much resistance within certain communities to any kind of data collection in social work is because of our historical practices. What we're seeing today is directly as a result of what we did in the past, and we really need to make up for it in order to be trusted again within many communities. So I'm just going to give you a very brief historical context of research ethics. Many of you have probably heard of the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the US, where for 40 years, Black men were studied and how syphilis affected them over the course of their lifetime. And many of them actually died, despite the fact that treatment for syphilis became available in the 40s with the advent of antibiotics. So this led to a lot of backlash within the US and stimulated the development of their own ethical protocols. However, the US was not the only one carrying out these horrible experiments. We had a history of that here in Canada as well as internationally. So many of you probably have also heard of the experiments that were conducted on Jewish and other concentration camp prisoners during the Second World War, and then additional experimentation was undertaken upon many Chinese and Vietnamese citizens by Japan in the form of Unit 731 during this time. As a result of these atrocities, the United Nations put forward Nuremberg Code, basically setting forth some basic ethical principles for medical research involving humans, such as the requirement for informed consent. In 1975, the World Medical Association updated the Nuremberg Code through the Declaration of Helsinki to also ensure that the risk and the burden to the participants should not outweigh any benefits. The researcher needs to stop the study if risks are found to outweigh potential benefits, etc. So jumping back to Canada for a moment, a few of the very horrible things that researchers have done over the past 100 years are listed here, and this is just a small portion of them. But in Canada in 1921, for instance, Dr. Hinks conducted a mental hygiene survey of the province of Alberta, and the results of this survey were used as justification for the Sterilization Act. What Dr. Hinks argued was that immoral behavior was the result of low levels of intelligence, and that social stability required that these people not be allowed to have children in order to control this abnormal population. And this continued for dozens of years until it was challenged in court when it was viewed that all these troublesome children that Dr. Hinks had identified were in fact mainly poor children who were being raised without much access to school and education. And that's why they were scoring lower on IQ tests that were being administered to them. We also have the Montreal experiments in the 50s to 60s, and the First Nations nutrition experiments, for which I gave you a reading with this week's class. So as you saw in the reading, the government appointed doctors and professors who went into these First Nations communities and schools found that there were very high levels of malnutrition. But instead of fixing the issue and addressing the malnutrition by providing more food, they decided to use it as the perfect opportunity to conduct a lot of what we would now call unethical experiments. Frankly, there was also pushback at the time as well, but it was uh, pretty quickly silenced. So within residence schools, children were denied food so that they could be part of a control group to see what would happen if certain vitamins are not provided to children. Even when these children developed anemia and other serious medical conditions, the experiments continued. The Montreal experiments were on mental health patients. This was actually a CIA-funded study that looked at how, drug-induced sleep, intensive electroconvulsive therapy, sensory deprivation, and things like Thorazine and LSD could be used to treat depression, schizophrenia, and other mental health illnesses. What it ended up actually doing, though, was causing severe brain damage to many people. More recently, a lot more recently, this only happened 25 years ago, we've got what are known as the Texas vampires. So it was found that a population in Newfoundland, specifically in Labrador, had a very high prevalence of a genetic heart disorder. So a lot of researchers, specifically from the Baylor Research Institute in Texas, hence the name Texas Vampires, flew into the community and conducted a lot of medical assessments and ECGs and other blood tests on this population, and then left again. They didn't share their results even when they found through their ECGs and other medical tests that certain members of this population were actually at very, very high risk of immediate illness from this heart disease, and that they needed treatment immediately, basically. So that resulted in several premature deaths within their study population. In Canada, the policies on ethics unfortunately did not emerge immediately after the discovery of these unethical experiments. Instead, it was quite delayed. The Medical Research Council of Canada only issued ethics guidelines in 78 and then updated them in 87. And the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the one that governs most social science research in Canada, waited until 81 to issue their guidelines. In 98, the three primary councils, so the Medical Council, Social Sciences, and Engineering, issued their Tri-Council Policy Statement, also known as the TCPS, which is what we follow to this day, though if they've updated it to the TCPS2. And basically what that means is now we have certain human research protections in Canada and everywhere else, basically. And that includes beneficence, respect for persons, and justice. So the respect for persons is that right to autonomy for all people. And it basically translates to having informed consent, which means you need to know what the risks are of a study in order to be able to consent for it. And it also requires that children who are not legally able to provide consent are asked to provide assent, informed assent, so that they also need to agree to any study or experimentation that takes place. The beneficence basically means do no harm while maximizing the benefits for those who are taking part in the research. What we saw with things like the Tuskegee study and the First Nations nutrition experiments is that the benefits of those findings went to the population that was not being examined, right? So we know or are better aware of the benefits of certain vitamins because of the First Nations nutrition experiments, but they never provided those same vitamins to the actual studied population, causing great harm to them. And I'd like to also note that the exact same experiments could have been done with animal models without actually harming First Nations children, but they also knew that at the time and had the animal model results to prove it. Anyway, the last one is justice, and that's the one that was lacking the most, making sure that reasonable, non-exploitative, and well-considered procedures are being administered, and that cost and benefits to potential research subjects are equally distributed. So you can't use something like a prison population in order to find out benefits for a non-prison population. Let's look now at the historical social work context that we are working with, and this is going to impact you as you go into practice. Social workers have had a lot of impact on a lot of people's lives over the last 100 years, and these impacts were not always positive. Even though we started out with that settlement house movement in the 1900s, where they were trying to ensure that people had adequate housing and food, it came from a very paternalistic place, and it came with the idea of the deserving versus undeserving poor. Some people deserved aid, others did not. And that informed the social welfare policies of the 1930s, which were very much focused on individual responsibility for poverty, housing, etc. And then, of course, there's child protection policies, which social workers have been enforcing for the past 100+ years. We had the 60s scoop back in the 50s and 60s, and what that basically resulted in was huge numbers of First Nations children and Inuit children and Métis children being removed from their communities and placed in white foster homes and adoptive homes. And we're seeing the exact same thing right now, and we're calling it the millennial scoop, because right now First Nations children and Black children as well are very much overrepresented in child protection agencies. First Nations children make up 2.5% of Ontario's population, but they're almost a quarter of the children in care, 9.3 times higher than what it should be. And the same results are for Métis, Inuit, and children of Caribbean or African descent. So a lot of these issues stem from how we've approached social problems in the past, looking at things from a very individualistic perspective, disproportionately impacting certain communities over others. Unfortunately, my stupid video is blocking this. But within child welfare, we've also very much blamed mothers when there's any issues in the family, as opposed to looking at both parents or caregivers equally. And we're also penalizing parents for being poor and implementing mandatory reporting laws in ways that make people more hesitant to seek out help. School social work is another example of where social workers are unfortunately doing, in some cases, more harm than good. Things like zero tolerance policies for bullying are resulting in a lot of predominantly Black children being expelled from schools and entering the school to prison pipeline. For those of you who haven't heard of that, that's basically how Behaviors towards predominantly Black children in schools, such as increased risk of getting detention, suspension, or expulsion, are preventing these children from getting an education and basically pushing them towards pipeline to the criminal justice system and imprisonment as adults. Social workers working in health and mental health face similar history of issues. For one thing, within Canada, we still see Black and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit mortality and morbidity to be much, much higher than the white population. Women who are Black or Indigenous are much more likely to die in childbirth than white women. And this is an issue that continues because we don't believe Black women about their pain or when they feel that something is wrong. The social determinants of health also have a much more unequal impact on members of our society. Food insecurity, for instance, impacts Black households almost 3 times more than white households. And of course, there's the environmental racism as well that's becoming more and more acknowledged, which disproportionately impacts low-income classes and people of color. So, for example, here we can see in Sarnia and to the west, going almost as far as Windsor, what's known as Chemical Valley. This is where we've got a huge concentration of petrochemical, petroleum, and energy facilities, and it's going right through several First Nations reserves. This is one of the most polluted places in Canada, and it is concentrated where First Nations people live. And we see the same thing right here in Windsor. The Ambassador Bridge runs right through, or right over, I should say, some of the poorest neighborhoods in town, and those who cannot afford to move to escape the pollution from those trucks. And the new bridge is going to do exactly the same thing. So how can we build back trust and actually be able to work and conduct research with these populations who we have hurt so much in the past? We need to make sure that they have the right to refuse and that they are actually asked to consent properly. And we need to make sure that we are using culturally appropriate interventions and assessments. And one of the, or two of the ways I should say, that we are starting to do this is through participatory action research and community-based participatory research. And what both of those mean is basically including the people who are your participants in the research design process. So they're there as part of the research team helping develop the hypotheses, the research methods, the data collection. They are co-owners of any data that is collected and any of the results that are published as a result. We also tend to now pilot test with very small groups of people to make sure our interventions are not harmful before we do a wide-scale release. And most importantly, for you who might not necessarily be doing large-scale studies, but will definitely be doing evaluations, don't lie with data and graphics and reports. And I'm going to cover now a few of these because this is continuing to hurt people and it is very much active right now in 2023. So, for instance, we've got people like Professor Philippe Rushton from Western University, who argued that correlations between race and intelligence are due to fundamental genetic and biological differences between the races. So he used charts like this one here, and again, my video is blocking it, but the last column says black, to argue that certain races are more likely to commit crime because of inherent differences. But as we learned in the first lecture, correlation does not mean causation. So tables like this do not factor in many confounding variables, such as discriminatory application of our laws and the criminal justice system. The Black men are much more likely to be stopped by police for no reason than white men, etc. We've also got people like Professor Jordan Peterson from the University of Toronto. Are you sensing a pattern here? A lot of these people have doctor in front of their name, and they're connected to major universities. So they're perceived as experts, and people listen to them without necessarily questioning what it is they're saying. So Peterson, if you haven't heard of him, he's got a large media following for being a truth teller and not succumbing to the liberal agenda. He only became prominent because he vocally opposed the addition of gender identity as the prohibited ground for discrimination under the Canadian Human Rights Act. But since then, he's continued disseminating false information on social media, such as this chart here. And again, my stupid video is covering part of it. But basically what he's arguing with this chart is that climate research and the global warming is not actually a real thing, as shown by the fact that historically we've had much warmer periods of time compared to where we are now. And if it wasn't for my video, you'd see that the data point, the last one, is actually down here. What you wouldn't see from this chart is the fact that these readings are from one place in Greenland over 100-year time span. So this is not international data. This is just one point in Greenland collected by one research team. So this is why it's so important to make sure you contextualize and really think about the information you're seeing, even when it looks all nice and pretty and truthful. How else do people lie with graphs? Well, basically all graphs from Fox News. This is a perfect example. So here's Tucker Carlson arguing that we used to be an enthusiastically Christian nation and showing how far the Americans have dropped in their belief from 77 to 65%. However, if you'll notice, his y-axis here starts at 58. So what he should have done is start at 0. But that would have messed up his message and his fear-mongering, because when you start at 0, you can see that the difference really isn't that big. And they do this all the time. For instance, here he is complaining about female labor force participation and how it's skyrocketed in recent years. But again, his y-axis starts at 65. So if we were actually to drop this down to 0 the way it should be, you would see that the increase is not as high as he's fearing, and that it is actually could be higher. So why do we visualize data? We do it to more effectively tell a story when we're not trying to lie with it. And we do it to simplify the information and to advocate for making a choice. And that's why so many people mess with graphs. They're trying to make people think a certain way. But we are going to be good researchers and social workers, and we're not going to do any of that. We're going to show the data as it is and contextualize it and help people come to the right decision. So, for instance, here's a great example from the federal government. I just love this. So here, with this example, we can see that the federal subsidies for fossil fuels are equal to the renewable energy investment. However, 29 billion is not the same as 72.5 billion. So you can say that the use of pie chart here is very misleading, because it should be cut off like this instead, but it is not. So we do not want to do this. We do not want to trick people into thinking something that doesn't exist. And unfortunately, we see this all the time in the media. So here we've got a newspaper looking at full-time students and basically increasing the fear of drugs by showing how many students are using opiates, alcohol, and cocaine daily. But look at the numbers that they're actually presenting. So people who are daily using opiates are zero, but they've still given them, a very high white rectangle. 0.4 has an even higher red rectangle. Again, people using cocaine, 0.3%, and that rectangle is half of the 48.4 who said they've never used it. Oh. And then we've got police. Police also love to share information that is um, shifted in their favor, I should say. I do need to let you know this is American data. Look, they did the right thing. They started at 0 for this y-axis, which is great. But what they did to try and show that the number of homicides is decreasing is they split 2016 into 2 points instead of 1. And the second 2016 point is actually just for 1 month. So basically, these two should be added together, and there should be a notation to say that it's not even been the full year. This is only counting the first 8 months of the 2016 year. So for this campaign, it was no to drugs, yes to peace and order. And unfortunately, you see that a lot, especially during election time, where people argue for increasing the amount of funding for police services instead of for social support services. All right, so what should you be doing instead? You should be truthful with data. So something like this, 50% of graphic designers have red hair. You need to be able to give the survey size. If it's only 2 designers, that size matters and needs to be noted. Over 2 million Americans exposed to drinking water will die this year. Important, because correlation is not causation. We all drink water, and we will all die someday, right? The average adult has 1 testicle. Just because it's true doesn't mean it's actually meaningful, because, half the population is female, right? And lastly, the top's tax rate will soon skyrocket to 39.6% when it used to be 35%. And again, this is that not starting at 0 on the y-axis. That is my biggest pet peeve. So make sure you do not do it for any charts you submit to this class, because it is one of the predominant ways that people lie with data. So what type of chart should you be using? You need to consider if you're comparing values, or you want to show the composition of something, or if you're trying to understand the distribution of your data. So the type of chart will really depend on the question you need answered. In order to compare values, we usually use a column chart. So this is a type of bar chart where you use different columns to compare groups. If you want to look at the composition of something, you usually use a pie chart, but you need to be careful with these pie charts. If you have more than about 5 categories, they can be very hard to read. If you want to understand the distribution of something, you can use a bar chart. Or for trends over time, you can look at what's known as a line graph. To understand the relationship between 2 variables, you'll use what's known as a scatter plot with a trend line. And we'll be doing lots of these when we start looking at correlations and regressions. It's also important to think about how you present your tables as well. So this table, which shows the express needs of individuals with disabilities and how much they need them, contains a lot of information, perhaps a little too much information. A better way of presenting it might be to combine some of the categories so the information more clearly stands out. However, you don't want to decrease it too much, because then there's no, you lose too much information. So basically, in review, research, statistics, and graphic visualization are important for increasing our knowledge and ensuring we're not causing harm through our interventions, but it's frequently misused. And this historical misuse of research against Black and Indigenous people of color has resulted in mistrust of researchers, research, and statistics. And we need to critically assess any graphs and figures presented in the media and in research studies, because, as I mentioned in the introduction video, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics.